Okay, so the floor is open. So please, when you speak, introduce yourself and the organizations you are representing. So the first is
at the far end of the room. We almost need binoculars. John Rex from AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. This has been fun presentations. I want to point at a specific place where I'd like to propose we should have some discussion. Both the new addendum and the IDSA position speak of permitting alternative pathways for unmet need. As an example, in slide 8 from Amanda Jezik, spoke of applying the LPAD idea only where there are few or no adequate current treatments. My question here is about the implied idea that having one or two new drugs would abate our concern and hence eliminate the crisis. It would seem that the window for unmet need would close and only open again when we've developed resistance to those one or two new agents. The EMA addendum does partially address this on page 13 in section 3.4.2 when it notes that a second or sequential agent that may address the same types of pathogens could also be considered for initial approval based on limited data. But I think there's a tension here, and I'm obviously implying by my question that I think we need multiple agents developed in advance of future epidemics. And I'd like us to debate that further. Might it be the case that there is always an unmet need?
Yeah, who is ready to comment this question? It's EMA or Mark?
Well, Amanda first.
Thank you, and thanks to John for his always thoughtful questions. I would just note, I apologize if I did not explain the LPAD proposal correctly. It's certainly not IDSA's belief that one or two agents would mean that we no longer have an unmet need. I think I mentioned that we developed, along with the Pew Charitable Trust, some principles to guide the development of LPAD legislation. And in those, which I apologize I didn't bring to the meeting today, but in those we explicitly say that LPAD would need to be crafted in such a way as to allow for multiple drugs for an individual indication in order to make sure that we had a robust variety of drugs for treatment options. So certainly I think when we say few or no treatment options to be available in order for something to qualify for LPAD, we don't just mean one or two. We want to see a robust amount of options for all of these indications.
So as you can see, a lot of flexibility. Please go ahead.
Richard Backe, just to endorse John Rex's point. I was brought up in the second, third and fourth generation area with cephalosporins, and what we do need is multiple drugs, some with old activities protected by beta-lactamase inhibitors, and we desperately need totally new agents, some of which will be more broad spectrum than others. It's only then that we'll be able to address the needs of individual patients and the increasing antimicrobial threat. What we also need to do is to look at the immunological response to infection, because obviously antibiotics are blunted and at the end will become resistant. So there does need to be a lot more activity in looking at antimicrobial peptides and things like that as well, but we do need lots of them. Of course, many different circumstances occur, and I guess that in the developing world they will be much faster than in the developed world, and that will also need a new agent specifically.
Thank you. Other question, comments? Mirko?
David Livermore, University of East Anglia. Pointed to Dr. Eisenstein, you highlighted cost of clinical trials. Phase 3 trial, roughly 1,000 patients, $50 to $70 million. And those are the typical sorts of figures I hear. That divides out to $50,000 per patient. That's typically far more than the cost of the patient's total treatment for whatever they were in hospital for in the first place. Why is it so expensive? What can be done to get this down? And surely this is a way to actually reduce the barrier to entry to this field and let lots more smaller pharmaceutical companies in if we can get that cost of entry to the field down?
Well, I thank you, Dr. Livermore, for raising this question. I would, as much as you would, like to see the cost reduced. And in fact, working for a pharmaceutical company that presently has 3 antimicrobials in phase 3, we would like to see nothing more than to have those costs reduced. And we're doing, quite frankly, everything we can to do so. But despite our efforts, there are certain inalienable truths about clinical trials. One of them is yield. So when you try to enroll patients in a clinical trial, it turns out that if you can only enroll 1 in 5, 1 in 10, or sometimes 1 in 100, it still means you have to screen large numbers of patients. Second, you have to have significant number of people involved at the site of the enrollment to ensure that you have ethics that are being maintained, to ensure that the proper rights and responsibilities have been mentioned and the appropriate informed consent is given. You cannot just depend upon the untrained nurse that happens to be bringing the patient up to the floor to serve in those duties. You also need to have significant control mechanisms in making sure that the data that one has collected is absolutely accurate. And parenthetically, the amount of data collection is much more rigorous in terms of being able to put together a regulatory dossier than it is for others. I have to give you my own experience 10 years ago working at Cubist, as I still am, when we were making an attempt to develop daptomycin, now known as Cubicin, for VRE, vancomycin-resistant enterococci. And we could enroll one in something like 50 patients that we screened. We ended up with something like 10 or 15 patients at a cost of over $100,000 to $150,000 per patient that we actually enrolled. And we did everything that we could in terms of analyzing that cost structure and through the vicissitudes I've mentioned earlier in trying to reduce that, and could not reduce that. And the small company that we were made us decide that we had to abandon that trial, even though we knew that was an unmet need and one that was an important one to try to overcome. I would like to hear from my colleagues on the panel in industry, John Rex, for example, for his thoughts on this. Thank you.
Okay, John.
Thanks, John Rex, AstraZeneca. The point I would emphasize is that let me compare 2 kinds of clinical settings. Let's say you want to do a study of a new drug for asthma. You can take out an ad in the newspaper and ask people to come to a central site somewhere. So you might have one site in an entire city where people would be referred for their study for asthma. And so at that site, you need to have all the machinery in place, the drugs, the people, the trained people. But really, one site can serve a very large area because the patients with asthma have it chronically. You don't have to find them at the moment of their acute out. You want to sign them up perhaps and give them something to do when they have an exacerbation. Compare that with an infection. Critically ill patient is in a hospital somewhere. If I do not start them on a drug within a couple of hours, not days or weeks, hours, actually they have a real problem. And if I wait very long, they've actually had too much drug before they go in, I can put them into study. So what it means is that I have to have a study, I have to have individual hospitals set up, ready to go. And I actually have to have lots and lots of hospitals because there's not enough time to transfer people to another hospital. So what you end up with is having hundreds of sites open, hundreds of sites, each site enrolling perhaps 1 or 2 patients per month. You heard Barry talk about the fact that many are screened, few actually make it through. So, but each one of these sites, I have to have staff who are funded. I have to have drug that is in stock and monitored and audited. So every one of those sites costs me money every day just to keep open looking for those patients. So that's actually the big driver, David. And I don't know how to fix that problem because you can't refer people to a central site to get started on their therapy for intra-abdominal infection. You have to do it right where they are that day in that hospital.
I absolutely take the points that you both make, but surely this is a huge issue in that if you can only recruit one patient in 100 of those who've got the clinical condition, one has to ask how representative are those 1 in 100 of the generality of patients with that particular condition. If the ethical requirement has become such that it becomes too costly, too complex to recruit, and that patients therefore get unpleasant and rather toxic standard treatments such as colistin instead, then how ethical is that?
Let's ask other speakers because I understand there are some. Please go ahead.
Well, my comment is in another side of the discussion.
So if someone will comment on this question of the recruitment, this cost and ethical question which was just raised, please go ahead.
There we go. David Friedland from Sorexa. I just want to let you know that there is something going on in this area. There's a group in the US called CITI, CTTI, Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, something like that. And they're meeting next week, actually, to talk about hospital-acquired pneumonia and ventilator-associated pneumonia and how to make the trials more simple, easier to do, collect less data, and therefore make the studies more feasible. And so I think that's a very strong area that might help in the future. But and just another point why studies are so expensive is that as a sponsor, you have to capture data that you might never think you might never need, but you have to capture it just in case things change. And certainly in the United States for the past few years, the endpoints have changed after the studies have been completed. And so if you didn't capture data to keep up with the changing regulatory environment, you'd have nothing. You'd have spent that $50 million and have nothing at the end of the day. So you really need stability in the regulatory endpoints and guidance, and that won't change after you start the study to make studies simpler.
I think we should add the word stability to the catalog of flexibility and clarity. I think stability is one more. So please, the patients now.
Yes, Hildrun Sanz at European Institute of Women's Health. Now, I'm obviously a lay person, so my question may be very naive to all you people who are much closer to the issue. But to come back again to the clinical trials and the cost of them, etc. I know there is a conflict, in my view, at least it looks like there's a conflict between competitiveness of industry and collaboration. Because if these cases are really so rare sometimes, it would make sense to collaborate and also bring us back again to the debate that is present very high on the agenda at the European level, sharing the clinical trial data. So I'm just wondering, and it may be a naive question, but would there not be more leeway for cooperating, collaborating at a pre-competitive level? And could that perhaps bring down costs?
Very good question. Someone like to comment direct to the question? So I see here voice and to my left. So please go ahead.
I would just like to refer here, I'm Angela Wittelsberger from the Innovative Medicines Initiative. So in our ND4BB program, that's what one of the objectives is, to establish this clinical site and investigator network that would have the capacity and the capabilities of running these clinical trials. And there it's a collaboration between different FPR companies.
Okay.
Just wanted to add to that, Eisenstein again, not only the IMI, but also in the United States, the NIH recently gave out a large proposal for academic sites to put together a network for clinical trials units in many ways, as they've done before for fungal infections and for AIDS infections. And we very much in industry look forward to working with these public-private partnerships.
Please, and then.
Yes, Anthony Coates from St George's, London. The first randomized clinical trial ever done was done in tuberculosis in 1948. And those trials have been continuing ever since and are getting more and more sophisticated. I know we're not considering tuberculosis today, but we can learn from the tuberculosis field. And one or two of the points which I'd like to bring to your attention are the use of microbiological endpoints, which are used in tuberculosis now. This enables you many more time points per patient, and therefore you can reduce the numbers of patients. You can use much more sophisticated statistics to achieve this aim. So I think I would suggest that in order to reduce the cost of phase 3 clinical trials, we could do quite well, actually, to look at the tuberculosis experience.
Since you use tuberculosis experience, I think we also have interesting example from regulatory front. We have the drugs under revision now and the orphan designation for the tuberculosis. So I think it would be interesting also to, I think tuberculosis, it's still infection. I don't hear this other cause. So it was interesting to use those examples to our other fields. So please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mike Dudley from Rempex Pharmaceuticals. Addressing the question, I think that Dr. Livermore opened up about the cost of development programs as well. I'd like to bring up another aspect of this, which is actually not oftentimes discussed. We've made tremendous progress and have identified the issues pertaining to clinical trial costs and their feasibility. But the other issue, which now is falling on the pathway, which will still need to be solved here, is the manufacturing requirements that are oftentimes made of products, even entering clinical trials. So, for example, in many areas of Europe, one requires a year's worth of stability on a investigational product before one can enter that product into clinical trials. That results in significant delays in being able to initiate the trial. So we can accelerate our processes through the early stages of development and getting towards patients. But if we have to literally sit on the sidelines and wait for a chemistry experiment to mature before we can enter trials, that may not get us drugs as soon as we'd like. So I would be interested if there are discussions among the regulators and others of looking at, for these types of programs, of whether or not there can be some modifications on the expectations of what information and certainty can be available, so that at least clinical trials can be initiated. Because the cost of these materials at the very early stages can be as high, David, as $50,000 per kilogram of material. Which is quite expensive in the early manufacturing stages because we don't have a lot of experience in manufacturing them.
Anyone like to pick up on this question about, because again, the call for the reduction of cost, and this, I don't see we have experts in the room from the clinical trials in this stage of development. So, okay, so leave this for as a good question. So look for the answer. Please go ahead.
Yes, that's Rafael Canton from Spain and also currently UCAS chairman, and appreciate the comment of Dr. Eisenstein on the breakpoint issues. We think this is a critical one, as you put in your slide. And we are doing a lot of efforts at UCAS level on this issue. You know, we have a high program, well disseminated, just to define which are the susceptible microorganisms compared to the resistant one, and less to the non-susceptible one. You have all the information in our website on the wild-type distribution, and this is a critical point also, just to define which patients can be benefit for the new agents. But also in the PK/PD breakpoints, we are also doing a lot of efforts on that. We know the pharmacokinetics, we know the pharmacodynamics, but also it's critical there just to have a precise MIC. And sometimes this is not so easy to have a precise MIC. You know that new agents, anti-gram positive, has problems on susceptibility testing in the laboratory, just to define the precise value to do that. And also if we move to the anti-gram negative, and the comment from Richard Backe on the beta-lactamase inhibitor is really difficult sometimes to define which is the concentration, how these antibiotics with these inhibitors should be tested. So we are doing a lot of efforts to understand this. And we know this has also an important consequence. But beyond that, and this is a comment that I would like to take you in your attention, it has been commented also that a lot of effort should be done on rapid diagnostic testing. But also, I think in the future, we will have to do an effort in rapid antimicrobial susceptibility testing beyond the MIC, just for doing this comparison. And I think in the future, we will have these programs to do these efforts on this very particularly issue, just to understand which patient can be benefit with this rapid antimicrobial susceptibility testing.
Comment on this rapid diagnostic and evaluation tests, any developments, any new ideas? Because it's very critical also from the selection of patients and clinical decision. Okay, so please, John.
At the risk of running my mouth again, John Rex. The new diagnostic tests, it's interesting what they can do. It's also important to realize what they cannot do. And to understand the latter is very helpful. It's important to realize that when you have someone with a serious infection, you actually have to start appropriate therapy as quickly as possible. And that's within minutes, if not an hour or two. It is unlikely that a rapid test will ever be rapid enough to influence the first dose of the drug. What you're looking for, however, it might be by the second dose that the rapid test can help you in some ways, but it still doesn't always give you all the information that you need. So I would actually say that I think that the new EMA guidance has nicely dealt with this by specifically saying that you are permitted at least a certain period of prior antibiotic therapy. That will make a big difference. And I think that then having tests that can either rule out a bacterial infection, that's very powerful, or rule in specific pathogens within 24 hours can actually make a big difference. And so that's my challenge to the diagnostic manufacturers, is we need point-of-care testing. You can't have to ship it off. It needs to start rapidly, and it needs to turn around within a few hours.
Technical call. If you finish your intervention, just turn your mic off so we can. Okay, and please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mike Dudley again. I'd like to underscore what John Rex has just said as well, and also, though, point out an issue that that CDC has actually been pointing out as part of their antimicrobial resistance working group, with these other, let's call them non-culture-based diagnostic procedures. And we need to think about some of the unintended consequences of these. And one of those has been seen most strongly in the area of gonorrhea, whereas when one begins to move to non-culture-based diagnostic techniques, the lack of bacterial cultures then result in lack of organisms to test for antimicrobial resistance. And thus, then, one is oftentimes going to not be able then to practice stewardship or know local susceptibility techniques if one is just focusing on a rapid read on what the bug is. So I think we have to be careful about what these rapid diagnostic techniques may be and some of the unintended consequences of the loss of information on antimicrobial susceptibility as we move away from culture-based diagnostics.
I think it's a very, very interesting point. I think it's how to balance this new approach and still get the information about the organism. So comment from IMI, and then we go to this end of table. Oh, so sorry, from Amanda, sir.
Thank you. So I just wanted to mention that IDSA absolutely agrees that we need to be focusing our diagnostic development efforts on very rapid point-of-care diagnostics, and that certainly physicians still need to have the ability to treat empirically whenever that's in the best interest of the patient. We have launched a report that's available on our website just yesterday on diagnostics issues, and we noted within the U.S. one of the biggest problems facing both the development of diagnostics and then the ability to actually use diagnostics once they are available is reimbursement issues. And I know that's something that I think folks will be talking about later on the drug side. But for diagnostics, there are very similar problems in that our Medicare program very often does not reimburse diagnostics, even for the cost of just using them, let alone anything on top of that. So that's a problem that we're going to be working on, and that you'll hopefully see a lot more from us on in the coming months.
I think it would be interesting to come back to the discussion around the reimbursement, because I think we're got very provocative, presentation from Ed with many facts, which basically say we don't do things well. But let's come back to this in a minute. But I would like to finish on the development side. So please, the point here, and then we move to other end.
Thank you. So Charles Penn from the World Health Organization. Slightly different perspective, if that's okay. One of our functions, along with similar functions performed by a number of national agencies, is to provide guidance to our member states on health practices, including treatment, and that includes use of medicines. And in doing this, we work in a very different way. We perform a different function to the regulatory agencies, so it's different from the market authorizations. And the guidance we give needs to be based on the evidence and the knowledge of the use and benefits, costs, and so on of these medicines. So my question relates, I think, to this topic, which is, as we seek to streamline, to make easier, more effective, reduce the cost of the early stages of medicine development and approval, the risk is that we will have less information when these medicines are introduced on which to base that kind of guidance. And so the quantity and quality of information that is developed after that approval becomes crucial. And in this area, even more so, because we want to develop concepts of stewardship in use of medicine. So I'd be interested in maybe comments or expansion from the medicines agencies, industry, and clinical practitioners on how we can, if you like, counterbalance the faster approval with stronger requirements for good quality evidence post-marketing.
I will also refer you to the documents you will get, during the coffee break, when we try to characterize the approval system in European Union, including the conditional marketing and exceptional circumstances, which basically go to this direction that we try to be quick, but under conditions that the follow-up action is very much regulated and under control. But I think it's very important question with the balance, because basically the public and patients will tell us, okay, we are ready, but also you should be ready as a system. So continue on this front, and then I'd like to go to a little bit for the reimbursement pricing, because I think it's a crucial one as well. So there's the point here, and Mirko. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm Mirko from, strange prostate cancer patient organizations, but I have a background in microbiology. I'm a bit puzzled because we are discussing something that's really needed, which is new diagnostic procedures, as well for identification as for the testing sensitivity of microorganisms. But we are here talking about new antibiotics. And it looks like the patient is coming in and is going to get it, the new one. Where we always think that you should first give what we have from the past, and if that doesn't work, then we go to the new ones. So when you are considering giving a new innovative antibiotic, the patient's already in your care, and I hope you've already got identified the microbe, and you know its sensitivity to the other stuff before you think giving something that's not yet available.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because we're speaking about treasure. We should not forget about the reality. So let's go to Mirko.
No, I just wanted to react to the comment from WHO, and indeed, it's quite clear that there are a number of options for committing companies to provide in the post-authorization phase with a number of studies and further evidence. And I think Mar this morning alluded to the fact that this will be very much on a case-by-case, depending on the drug, the properties of each new antibiotic, what are the plans from developers to further expand the indication. And clearly, even for a full market authorization, which could be a pathway even in an area of unmet need, still, according to the new pharmacovigilance legislation, it would be possible to impose to companies strong risk management plans, and also the possibility to impose post-authorization study, which would cover both safety and efficacy/effectiveness. So there are a number of tools that are available in order to try to follow on after the initial evidence at market authorization with further studies and further evidence that could, in a way, complement what was available initially. Of course, here we have to be careful because particularly in area of unmet need, where there is maybe a restricted spectrum of activity, the amount of information that could be generated post-authorization might be very limited. And of course, we will also to consider how far observational study can provide us with useful information when it comes to efficacy and effectiveness.
Can I ask maybe FDA, if you'd like to comment on your initiatives, because when you published this a few months ago, it was quite interesting. What is the kind of response from the industry, from academia, after the announcement of this new policy?
So Andres, you mean on the unmet need guidance document? Yeah. So, I think, Barry stated it well. I think there is a fair degree of convergence, with the EMA document coming out. And, as you can imagine, as we're working on developing pathways, we're talking with colleagues at the EMA. And I think everybody recognizes the critical need, for new drugs, particularly for patients who don't have options, who have serious infections. So, an unmet need pathway provides a more streamlined route to get drugs to patients who need them most. And as folks have said in their talks, it will be a less precise characterization of safety and efficacy given the more streamlined program. So, yes, it will be important that when a drug is out there, that it's continued to be followed throughout its life cycle. We may learn more important information about the safety of drugs that have gone out there, and that's critically important we continue to follow it. There may also be some new tools under development that may help us with this too. Within the U.S., there's the development of Sentinel, which will allow for following drugs that are out there and monitoring for safety findings. So I think there is real interest in this. Folks in industry are particularly interested in trying to address these unmet needs that are out there. And I think there are pathways. Certainly we'll gain experience as we work through some of these, but it's a critically important area and one that essentially needs to be addressed and needs to be solved so that we have new options for the patients who need them most.
Okay, so this is about, yeah.
David Findlay from GlaxoSmithKline. Mayor Powell highlighted what the indication statement might look like as a result of the limited clinical development program. Could I ask Amanda to comment on what the indication statement might look like from an LPAD perspective and make any comparisons between the two?
Just if I could be clear on your question on specific indications that we would want LPAD targeting, is that?
Yeah, what the wording might look like around the indication statement. So Mayor Powell highlighted that was around pathogen specific and how that would look from an LPAD's perspective.
I think at this point we are just trying to develop the legislation that would create this new pathway, and we would not want to put that level of detail into legislation, which is not something that I think would be appropriate for Congress. So I think that the legislation would likely leave it up to the FDA to be able to determine exactly what kind of specific information they would think would be important to put there. So I don't know if Ed would want to comment further at this point, but we would leave that in the hands of folks at FDA.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Adcox. I think the elements will be important to communicate will be that the drug really is for use when you don't have alternative options. And Amanda had a number of these elements in her slides, and it'll also be critically important to communicate the type of information that supported the approval so that people understand what the data were, what the limits of those data are, and that should help guide appropriate use. But if we think, too, about the bigger picture and how these drugs will be effectively used once out there, there's a critically important role for the healthcare community. And, so being able to identify these drugs, just having, some quick tool, message, way of flagging or identifying a drug that's the product of a more limited development program so that healthcare providers are aware and can use these drugs importantly as they're making their prescribing decisions will be critically important. So I think, and there are some models out there. One of the recent approvals for a TB drug, Backe, has, some of these sorts of ideas in it. It talks about using the drug when other drugs are not available. So approved in the U.S. Back in December 2012. So, some of this information, some of these ideas are out there in in sort of other labels, but it'll be important in the antibacterial realm where there's such a range and spectrum of benefit risk that we see with the patients that we treat with bacterial diseases, to really be able to identify a drug product that's been developed with a much more limited program. A key point there.
Happy to hear that there's still transatlantic dialogue going on in this room. It's a great to see this. Is a point here and then back to Barry. So yeah, go ahead, yeah, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. My name is Mirko. I'm a medical doctor representing the European doctors. I think we are asking a big and difficult task for the industry here because we want them to develop new drugs, and I, as a doctor, never want to use these drugs. So how should it be a business case for the industry ever to develop these drugs? I think we have to do it a very different way if we have to have new drugs available for very few patients, if hospitals should be able to pay these drugs afterwards. So another issue is to develop point-of-care tests. 90% of antibiotics are prescribed in primary care. This is not patients in hospitals. This is patients going in, maybe coming from work and going back to work. Maybe they are at home. So they are not critically ill. They have to be tested for which drugs to have before prescribing antibiotics for them. We have to use antibiotics in a very prudent way. Even if we get new drugs, we should be very restricted about using them. So I think it is a big task for the industry actually to go on this. Thank you.
I think we can start discussion about the policy and reimbursement and access and the responsibility. But Barry, last comment on the regulatory part, and I would like to spend 10 minutes on the.
But before that, I want to just completely applaud and agree with the comments of the preceding speaker in terms of stewardship, restriction, and at the same time to balance that off by reimbursement. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I actually have a question for Dr. Cox, and I don't know whether it applies to the EMA as well, but do you believe, Ed, that you already have the regulatory ability to go through with this now, or do you believe there's the need for new legislation, and why?
Right. So a little bit of a tricky topic. I mean, so with regards to LPAD, the administration hasn't taken a position on LPAD per se. The issue of patients out there where the need is critical, and we know that need is critical now. I mean, and so having something in place is urgently needed. And there are different routes to essentially affect change and provide clarity with regards to procedures for developing antibacterial drugs for particular subgroups of patients. So if there were new clear recognition of the importance and legislation can happen very quickly, that could certainly have an impact on the field in an immediate way that would help to provide clarity, tools for flagging a drug is one that was the product of an LPAD development program to help facilitate appropriate use and to make those that are using the drug aware of it. Without some degree of clarity, some degree of recognition of the importance of this, the approach may take more time, may be less clear, and I think given the urgency here, it's really important that there be that degree of clarity, that degree of recognition of the importance of developing in areas of unmet need. So there is real value and real importance in having a very clear and urgent recognition of the issue that we're facing here.
Yeah, Mirko.
Yeah, a comment also from the EMA side. Of course, we are quite open to discuss any possibility for new legislation and new way of introducing antibacterials into the market. But based on what the addendum is saying today, actually we have pathways and possibility to get these products on the market for a very restricted indication in area of unmet need without the need of entering into discussion around new legislation. So overall, we do believe that at this stage, at the level of benefit-risk consideration, it would be still possible to reach a favorable outcome based on limited evidence in this niche indication in area of unmet need. Of course, if we want to expand behind this, then of course we will need to talk about new legislation and new tool if the idea is to bring new antibiotics faster to the market, whatever is the indication.
So this is important because really we should use what we have, and also I think there's a call for stability, which I think is also part of this dimension. So let's maybe close this, and I really would like to have five maximum 10 minutes on this big issue about the bringing new medicines to the market, the pricing, the restriction, the cleverness of everyone on the market. So please.
Good morning. My name is Hannah Back-Peterson, and I'm managing the policy portfolio at WHO Europe for medicines and health technology. So my comment is just, and linking on to what was also mentioned by Dr. Eisenstein, the importance of new ways of bringing products to the market and how to consider both access and use. And if we look at the pricing strategies that we have in the public-private partnership been using so far, so like the advanced market commitment, the differential pricing, the risk-sharing schemes, and the patent buyouts, none of those pricing strategies have actually considered use. And I do think that is something that we would like to see in terms of innovation as well, that we more are linking innovation and product access and use together as we move ahead, and particularly in this area when we are looking upon how we make products available at country level and living in a globalized world. We of course realize that over-the-counter sales of medicines is quite common in many parts of the world. And while I do think that it's very important that in the country of origin and where research are taking place, that one is very careful to have very specific criteria for use and limiting use, these may not be followed once products are on the market and are available in vast parts of the world. So I just think this is something we need to sort of keep in mind for the future when we look. So when we look at innovation, that we also look at how can we link innovation and market access to affordability, but also in appropriate use. So that was the main comment. Thank you.
I can stress that we should look for ways to pay doctors not to treat, because usually doctors are paid to treat. So if we can invent systems, pricing or paying systems which stimulate that, it's okay, I think. Same to companies. We should make it possible to develop and not to sell. It's a new business model, of course, but I think we have to think of that.
It's remind me, my 2 years ago when I was prepared for the meeting with industry, and my son who studied economics this time at York University called me and asked, "Daddy, what are you going to do today?" I said, "I'm going to see the industry, and what are you going to discuss?" About the new antibiotics development. But what's the problem? I said the problem is they would like to have new antibiotics and not use them. And his answer was, "What's the business?" So I think it's a right question, but it was also the point that you said that not just reimbursement of antibiotics, but also reimbursement of diagnostic kits should be somehow discussed, because this is also the way we pay, as we know, as also said by European doctors. Also not just how we use, how we pay, how we initiate different ways of doing things. John.
John Rex again from AstraZeneca. This afternoon, I will talk about a new business model project, and part of that includes the discussion of what is appropriate use. And I'd like to take a moment to sort of point out a couple of issues around how not to define appropriate use. It's you might take the viewpoint that, well, we should always know what we're treating, and we should always know the susceptibility, so we should always be able to pick the right drug right away. In fact, despite all of our best tools, you often cannot know the organism, you cannot know its susceptibility, or you may not be able to know that for several days. If I give you an ineffective antibiotic for the next several days, you might die. I mean, it's as simple as that. There are clear data showing that every minute that goes by until you start an appropriate antibiotic, your mortality and morbidity go up. It's very clear. So the question about what is appropriate use, I think is a really hard one, because it's tempting to say that you can define it in terms of a by-patient event. Did this patient get the right antibiotic? Was it appropriate in this patient? I will make the argument that that may not be the most productive way to do it. What if instead our Millennium Development Goal for appropriate use was that all antibiotic prescriptions were guided via a structured thinking process? And I'm not going to define that, but rather that there was some use of guidance. So it could be, and that doesn't have to be by a physician, it could be that in an underserved area where there are not physicians, the decision to treat apparent ear infection is based on at least a few bits of clinical data that can be collected locally. So at least a process has been involved. And that might push you towards more often using drugs in a wise fashion. I think if you try to make it too tight, you run the risk of cutting off access to antibiotics that actually might keep people alive, and that's going to be the balance. So my emphasis is on a process-based approach to appropriate use rather than on a specific per prescription event.
You for coffee, sir.
Antonin Dremont from Paris. I wanted to comment of the discussion raised by Dr. Rice on the minute you lose and the patient die. And I was wondering how many patients in total that would concern. And I think we should put this kind of numbers in comparison to the numbers of patients that die because of the overuse of antibiotics that we have, particularly in developing countries. And I think that there is some kind of discrepancies between the huge amount of effort that are and money that is spent for developing new drugs and in comparison the small efforts which are made to decrease the use of those that we have, which is also a way to fight against resistance and to decrease mortality.
Will lead us to the next session when we discuss, prevention, but also how to prevent, those antibiotics we have, to survive and to still be available to patients and doctors. So Enrique will try to summarize in a few points what we have discussed here, so we can close this session and go for coffee.
Thank you everyone, the speakers and everyone who contributed to the discussion. Of course, it's difficult to summarize in a few minutes the rich inputs that we had in this workshop this morning, but I think it can be framed in three main points. One is around the clinical trials, how demanding and costly the clinical trials are in terms of selection of patients, trial design, availability of criteria to select these patients, including diagnostic tests, conduct of the clinical trials, and the fact that they are indeed very costly. I think on this topic we heard a number of new ideas, including the potential, the possibility of having collaboration of clinical centers as a new business models, and I'm sure we will see quite a lot of development in that area. A number of speakers have discussed, and in fact that was very much the focus of this session, as well as the discussion on the regulatory framework that allows the initiatives from industry to bear fruits and to come to actual products that go to patients. And here there was the presentation and some discussion on guidelines, current guidelines, particularly focus on the addendum that was just published yesterday and the unmet need guidance provided by the FDA this summer. I think overall the understanding at this point is that the regulatory framework has evolved and has is probably fit for purpose and allows companies to find the appropriate path to the development of new antibiotics for the unmet needs that are being identified and are clearly under everybody's eyes. What is important, I think that this framework is now getting, and several speakers have pointed to that, is now getting more and more in line and in tune in both sides of the Atlantic, as well as in other countries and regions in the world. And that's very important because the last thing we want is that industry sort of uses the inadequacy of the regulatory framework as an excuse, if you will, for not developing the right drug for the right patient population. I want to stress that particularly Mayor Powell said that we introduced quite a relevant element of flexibility. They are really intended to allow development of new antibiotic to meet the requirement of regulators and therefore get to patients as fast as possible. I think that the third aspect of that was relevant and is relevant for today's discussion is the one on what data that needs to be generated once approval is obtained, because this is a quite important second step. If we are going, and we are going into the direction of allowing or looking at antibiotics on a case-by-case basis, as Mayor stressed this morning, and so did Dr. Koch, we beg the question, how can we ensure that then the right data is generated, not only to meet the needs of health technology assessment bodies, but in fact to meet the needs of the patients and the healthcare professionals more in general. And we want to allow and to provide a very robust platform to generate this data and use them in order to improve the knowledge we have of this drug and make them available to patients. In this discussion, of course, we need to involve patient healthcare professionals, HTAs, and all the players and stakeholders who do have and must have a say in this discussion, because we will center on reimbursement, and reimbursement in itself or in turn is of course related to appropriate use and how can we incentivize appropriate use of antibiotics. This will be indeed the topic of the next session of today's workshop. So I think we can conclude this session, and I again thank all the speakers. I think it was extremely useful, interesting and stimulating discussion, and we invite the two chairs, invite you all for coffee, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. We meet here 35.